Chapter 96. There is a man in Punta Arenas who dreams of pine forests, hums German songs, wakes each morning and sees the black strait. He drives to a factory that smells of the sea. All around him are scarlet crabs, crawling then steaming. He hears the shells crack and the claws breaking. He sees the sweet white flesh packed firm in metal cans. He is an efficient man with some previous experience of the production line. Does he remember that other smell? Does he remember that other sound of low voices singing? Walter Rauff is the inventor of the gas wagon. That's chapter 96 of a book that many of you will have read by the English writer Bruce Chatwin called In Patagonia. I read it in 1982, and it was my first introduction to the name of Walter Rauff. I was a 21-year-old student. 35 years passed until I came across the name of Walter Rauff again. In the course of writing my book, The Rat Line, Ruta de Escape, I was given the correspondence of an Austrian SS officer, Otto Wächter. And amidst the 10,000 pages of letters and diaries, I found one letter sent by Walter Rauff from Damascus in Syria to his good friend and comrade Otto Wächter, which basically said, in May 1949, do not come to Syria, it would be better for you to travel to South America. The passage of 35 years tweaked my interest, not least because I had been a lawyer in the case involving Augusto Pinochet in London. And when I did a little bit of research about Walter Rauff, when I came across his name again in 2016, I saw that he had ended up in Chile. And that is what prompted me to start the research on what will be my third book in the series after Calle Este-Oeste and Ruta de Escape. So very briefly, let me introduce you to a little bit of background about Walter Rauff. Before I do that, can I just express my deep gratitude to this man, Carlos Basso, who is not just any interviewer. He has written extensively on the subject of Nazis in Chile, and I've read all of his work, and I want to express my deep gratitude to him for his generosity in sharing with me his information and his ideas. Without him, I would not be able to have made the progress that I've made. So let's start with the first slide, but it's not seeming, no, we don't want that one. We want that one. Walter Rauff in 1945. He's just been arrested by the Americans, and he is charged with mass murder, crimes against humanity and genocide in due course. The crimes for which he will eventually be charged include overseeing the design, construction, operation, and repair of small wagons retrofitted to gas about 50 inhabitants at a time, packed in very tightly, Jews and Poles, starting in late 1941 and throughout 1942. The best estimate is that as a result of his handiwork, 800,000 human beings were killed. He escaped. He made his way to Rome. He was taken in by an Austrian bishop, Alois Hudal, and he then eventually escaped to Syria, where he wrote a letter to Otto Wächter. From Syria, he traveled back to Italy, then made his way to Ecuador with his wife and his two children, and set up initially for the designer of a gas wagon. It's an appropriate sort of job as an auto mechanic for the Mercedes-Benz concession in Quito, Ecuador. There he intended to make the rest of his life, until in 1956 he met a charming Chilean military officer and his wife. They became friends. The military officer helped his two sons, Walter Jr. and Alf, to travel to Chile, where they enrolled respectively in the Army Academy and the Naval Academy. And Walter and his wife Edith followed 2 years later. They set up in Punta Arenas. He worked at a fishery cannery in Porvenir, and he made a good life for himself. He was embraced by members of the local population in Porvenir and in Punta Arenas. Then, in 1962, the government of West Germany discovered he was living in Chile and made a request for his extradition. And there was a proceeding in 1963. He resisted successfully the request for extradition because of a rule in Chilean law on a statute of limitations. You could not be extradited for a crime, genocide, or crimes against humanity, or murder, that had taken place more than 15 years earlier, and more than 15 years had passed. And so he returned to Porvenir. This is the house in which he lived. I took this photograph about 6 days ago. It overlooks the cannery in which he worked. I've met many of the ladies with whom he worked back in 1962 and 1963, and they said he was a delightful man. Indeed, when he died of natural causes 20 years later, they all told me they felt rather sad. This was despite the fact that they all knew the rumors about what he had done. He was embraced into local society. Then, in 1973, as you know far better than I, a significant event occurred. On September the 11th, there was a coup d'etat, and the junta, led by Mr. Pinochet, took over. It so happens that Mr. Pinochet was the friend of Walter Rauff. It was he who had been serving in Ecuador. It was Augusto Pinochet who encouraged Walter Rauff to move to Chile. And it appears that there was a degree of contact between them thereafter. And it's at that point that I become interested in what happened next. If you go on the web, you will find thousands and thousands of stories about how Walter Rauff worked for the DINA and for the regime of Mr. Pinochet. Stories like this one. But for those of you who were in the event yesterday, and as Carlos knows, I'm a lawyer, I do cases before international courts and tribunals. Rumors are not enough. I want hard facts. I want testimony or documents or other things. And that is what I have begun to start doing on my investigation of what really happened between 1973 and 1977. And I'm meticulous about my research. I'd mentioned the book in Patagonia. I went back to find the original diaries of the writer Bruce Chatwin at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and went through each of his 40 or so moleskin notebooks, and finally found what I was looking for. Early 1975, you will see on the third line down, Commandant Rauff, PA, Punta Arenas, mobile gas wagons is what is written underneath. In other words, Bruce Chatwin, wandering around Punta Arenas in late 1974 and early 1975, came across the name of Walter Rauff. And that begins the process of trying to work out for me what exactly did Walter Rauff do. There are many leads, indeed, and I'm grateful again to Carlos Basso for helping me on those leads. Colonia Dignidad, Isla Dawson, and indeed I have met one man, Leon Gomez, who in 1991 wrote an affidavit declaring in the clearest possible terms that Walter Rauff personally interrogated and oversaw his torture in August 1974 at Londres 38. And I was on Friday morning with Leon Gomez in the room in which he claimed Walter Rauff had personally overseen his act of torture 50 years later. It was an extremely moving moment. But there is one lead in particular that I have homed in on, and it relates in relation to a single photograph. And it is this photograph which holds the clue to what Walter Rauff actually engaged in. The photograph is taken in March 1976. It was not located and did not indicate where he was. Because of his notoriety, Rauff kept below the radar screen and did not give a lot of publicity to where he went or what he was up to in the years between September 1973 and 1977, when the DINA was wound up following the assassination of Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. But this photograph was taken in San Antonio, not so far from here. And in San Antonio, there was a fishery. And that fishery, I believe, was involved in the transportation of detainees eventually to their act of disappearance. And at this point, 3 years into my work on this, I have concluded that most likely, and I will continue for the next year, Walter Rauff was involved in the transportation and disappearance of detainees using refrigerated vans that transported detainees around various parts of Chile. There is obviously a chilling connection with his role 35 years or so earlier in parts of Nazi-occupied Germany. The research that I've done has led me to meet a range of absolutely remarkable individuals across Chile, people on both sides of the story, perpetrators, survivors, family members of people who did not survive. Last week I was in Punta Arenas, and I met, as I mentioned earlier, a group of remarkable ladies who had worked with Walter Rauff in Porvenir or in Punta Arenas. And it was very striking the way in which they described him in very similar terms. Elegant, cold, efficient, a very fair employer. This is the signature at the bottom of a letter that one of his employees shared with me when he kindly wrote a letter of reference to her in September 1968. And she told me she knew all about what he had done, but he was a decent employer and he treated her fairly and correctly. He even gave her additional holiday time and paid her for that holiday period. But one of the accounts that she gave, which was, to me anyway, fascinating, and it comes back to what was written by Bruce Chatwin, is that he was an absolute obsessive on the packing of the king crabs, the centoia, into the tins. And she described how he would walk down the production line, making sure that the flesh had been squeezed in as tightly as possible and that there were no legs hanging over the edge so that everything was neatly put into the tins. while I was in Punta Arenas, I did an event like this one at the University of Magallanes. And in the course of that event, there were a number of people present, including my good friend Baldovino, who is here today, who I salute with great respect. And a gentleman who had been a detainee at Isla Dawson raised a question that I think is a very fair question, and that I've thought about a lot since he asked it. The question that he asked was, why are you focusing on a single German, a former Nazi, who ended up in Chile and may or may not have been involved in certain activities associated with the DINA between 1973 and 1977? He said, there are so many Chileans you could be looking into. Why are you looking into this one German? Part of the answer to that question is that there is a direct connection with the stories that I have told in Calle Este-Oeste and in the Rat Line. And so there's a line that leads to the case in London in 1998 when Augusto Pinochet was arrested, where acts of disappearance became so significant. And of course there is the fact, which many of you may not recall, that when Augusto Pinochet was arrested, he was arrested in London for crimes against humanity, for genocide, and for the disappearance of many human beings, many of whom remain unaccounted for today, 50 years later. It is a continuing story. I'm acutely aware of that. And so there was the fact of the connection between what had happened in the stories I'd told before and the case I was involved in London. And it raised the tantalizing prospect that perhaps Walter Rauff even played a role in the facts that became so significant in the court proceedings in London in 1999. That's what I'm after. But it's also become, and this perhaps we can talk about, Carlos, acutely clear to me that Walter Rauff is emblematic of something else. Walter Rauff is emblematic, I think, of a culture of impunity, of a culture of turning a blind eye to things that happened or things that people are said to have done. He was embraced by a certain society in southern Chile as soon as he arrived in 1958. He was encouraged to be here by a man who would then lead his own bloody dictatorship from 1973. And I'm interested in exploring those connections, and in particular, the question to which, the extent to which matters of impunity continue today. Chile is not alone. There is impunity in the United Kingdom, there's impunity in many European countries, there's impunity in many countries across the world. But in a certain sense, for me, Walter Rauff reflects a deeply ingrained sense of impunity, and one that was picked up very strongly. If you read in Patagonia, you will pick up that sense of connection between what was happening in Punta Arenas and Porvenir when Bruce Chatwin was there in 1974, 1975, and what had happened in Tierra del Fuego in the late 19th and early 20th century in relation to the Selknam and other indigenous communities. Let me stop there and let's go over to you, Carlos.
¿Me escuchan ahí? Sí. Bueno, Philippe, muchas gracias antes que nada.
Yeah.
Te agradezco mucho todos tus conceptos tan amistosos. Y hablemos de semejanzas y de diferencias. Tú has investigado muchísimo el nazismo y también estás investigando la DINA hoy día. Y has entrevistado a gente que perteneció a esa agencia secreta. ¿Qué diferencias o qué semejanzas ves tú entre quienes participaban del nazismo, agentes del nazismo, agentes de las SS, y aquellos que participaban de la DINA?
So, just to say at the outset, I mean, I have spent the last 35 years working on a range of cases around the world. South America, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Congo, and I've come to understand that each case is very different, and I avoid drawing direct comparisons in terms of league tables of horror, so to speak. I think for the victims of any act of horror, what has happened to them is the worst thing in the world. So I can't answer your question in a direct way and say they're the same or they're different or this, that, or the other. There are points of similarity, but I think the first point that I would make in relation to the similarities is not in relation to individuals who were associated with acts of wrongdoing, but the sense of silence that exists in any community when something terrible has happened. I mean, I'm used to this in the United Kingdom. No one in Britain wants to talk about slavery or colonialism because it has left 150 years, 200 years later, a terrible taste. And so it's sort of parked away. As a child at school, we were never told about the horrors of the British Empire. That was just kept silent. And it's been the same thing as I've spent now quite a lot of time in Chile over the last 3 years, picking up a sense that a lot of people have a lot of stories, but basically they don't want to talk about them. And they don't want to talk about them because they worry that perhaps a parent or a grandparent may in some way have been involved in a way that was unpleasant. And so it is this sort of culture of silence which is very familiar to me from my own experiences, for example, in Austria, and to a lesser extent in Germany, but also, as you will see in my book, The Rat Line. And so that is a point of similarity. The second thing that I would say is that in relation to the perpetrators, those who've been on the receiving end of their generous and horrible acts remember tiny points of detail. They remember the sound of people's voices, and they remember, in the case of the gentleman that I was with at Londres 38 on Friday morning, the smell. Leon Gomez told me each time Romo, who was his main direct torturer, would approach the room, he knew he was coming because of his smell. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Because of the smell of Colonia Flanio, which he sprayed on himself in vast quantities. And the moment he could smell that, he knew what was coming." And it's that kind of tiny detail that concentrates the mind in relation to these kinds of issues. And in relation to the horrors that happened in Nazi Germany, for people who went through those horrors, those tiny points of detail also resound.
Volvamos un poco a tu personaje, Walter Rauff. Tú nos mostraste una foto de cuando fue detenido, una foto muy famosa, cuando fue detenido en Italia. ¿Cómo fue el tratamiento de Estados Unidos en ese momento hacia él? ¿Qué pasó cuando estuvo prisionero? ¿Supiste cómo escapó? Eso es una cosa que yo todavía no conozco. When he was cuffed by the Americans, nobody knows if he was.
Yeah. He was arrested in May 1945 by the Americans in Milan. Just so that you're aware, his horrors did not stop in 1941, 1942. He was then posted to North Africa, where the job he was given was to exterminate the entire Jewish community of Tunisia. But he failed because the British and American army recaptured Tunisia 6 months after he arrived. He was then posted to Italy, where he became the head of the Gestapo, the SS Gestapo, in the city of Milan. He operated out of a hotel, and his job was to eliminate opponents of that part of Nazi-controlled Italy. And he targeted partisans, communists, other political opponents, and Jews. And if you go today to Rome, still today, the name Walter Rauff is known as it is in Punta Arenas. Every person that I met in Punta Arenas knew the name of Walter Rauff. He was detained, and in 1948 or thereabouts, he escaped from his detention camp using wire cutters, and he made his way to Rome, where he was taken in by an Austrian bishop, Alois Hudal, and he was hidden for just under a year in a monastery called the Vigna Pia Monastery. And he actually lived in the same room that Otto Wächter would then occupy when he left for Syria. So that was the story that happened then. He was helped by people in Rome who were actually working as spies for the American army. So the American army knew exactly where he was, and he was part of that program known as the Rat Line, the Ruta de Escape, in which the Americans were using senior Nazi officers to identify their new opponents, the communists.
Después de eso, tú mencionas que él se fue a Damasco. Cuéntanos un poco qué hizo en Damasco y cuéntanos también un episodio que quizás es uno de los más controvertidos, que es una supuesta colaboración que tuvo con el Mossad. ¿Qué has averiguado de eso?
I found out a little bit about that period in 1949, 1950. I think collaboration is probably too strong a word. He had contact with a junior Mossad officer who was posted in Rome and who met with him on a number of occasions and shared information. What the Israelis were interested in is what was happening in Syria. They weren't interested in what was happening in the past. Now, I have now the name of the officer who he came to know, and that officer was subsequently, in 1978, retained by Mossad to eliminate Walter Rauff here in Chile and to kill him.
Wow.
And I have all of the Mossad materials which describe what happened in 1978. And embedded in that material of what happened in 1978 is a statement from the man who had known Rauff in 1949, 1950, and he said at that point he did not know about Rauff's past. But in 1978, the new Israeli government of Menachem Begin created a list of 10 Nazis living in different parts of South America. Klaus Barbie, Mengele, Bormann, and Rauff was on the list. And they developed a new project to identify them and either extradite them or kill them. In the case of Barbie, he was extradited, as you know. In the case of Rauff, unbelievably, a hit squad was sent to Santiago, and they came to within 30 seconds of killing him. And I've now got all of the documents in relation to that situation. I can also share with you sort of interesting tidbits of information. When Rauff then died in May 1984 in Santiago of natural causes, the government of Chile received a request from the government of Israel to inspect the body of Walter Rauff to make sure that he had well and truly died. And the foreign minister of Chile at the time gave permission for Israel to inspect Rauff's body, and they confirmed that it was indeed Walter Rauff.
Okay. Después de eso, estando en Santiago ya, se convirtió en agente del BND. ¿Qué sabes de aquello?
Yep, I know a lot about that. I've got all of the documents on that. And again, you know, the world, we know it, is a truly filthy place. And unbelievably, in the mid-1950s, while he was in Quito, Ecuador, Rauff was recruited by the BND, the German intelligence service, to report on communist activity in various parts of South America, including Ecuador. And he continued to be hired on a pretty low grade but he traveled to Germany, remarkably, using his own name, Walter Rauff, and while he was in Germany, a magazine, Der Spiegel, published an article mentioning him as having been identified in the then ongoing trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. It's a completely surreal situation. Rauff's wife, Edith, was incredibly worried about the newspaper article and thought that he might be arrested. And his response to her was, "Don't worry, I'm being protected by the BND. There is no difficulty at all." The BND, the German intelligence service. Curiously, when he was then arrested in Punta Arenas on the 4th of December 1962, the BND panicked because the German Justice Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had requested his extradition. So the BND immediately, news came out of his arrest, terminated his contract as a agent, if you like, of the BND and backdated the termination by 6 months so that it would not look as though he had been terminated because his extradition request had become public.
Okay. Yo te voy a hacer dos preguntas más. Vamos a dejar después espacio a que ustedes también hagan sus consultas. Y una de ellas es justamente, y esto como abogado, ¿qué opinas tú de la decisión que tomó la justicia de este país en 1963? ¿Tú crees que fue una decisión justa? ¿Que podían haber hecho algo distinto cuando se negó su extradición?
Well, there were actually two decisions. There was a first instance decision by the President of the Supreme Court, Fontecilla, who ruled that he could be extradited to West Germany, but that then went on appeal to the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court, and they ruled by 6 votes to 1 that he could not be extradited because of the statute of limitations. Curiously, there's here a strange point of connection, because as many of you will remember, in March 1999, the House of Lords in London, case in which I was involved, ruled also by 6 votes to 1 that Senator Pinochet could be extradited. And it's essentially the same issue, whether an individual who is associated with international crimes can be extradited or not to another country. Now, back in 1963, Chile had a 15-year statute of limitations. And the West German government had received advice from a leading Chilean criminal law professor, Miguel Schweitzer, advising that the case would fail because of the statute of limitations. And Miguel Schweitzer was correct in his appreciation of the law. And I'm not a Chilean law expert, so I can't express a view on whether it was right or wrong, but if a country has a 15-year statute of limitations, it seems to me it's very difficult to find a way around it, which is why I would not criticize President Allende 10 years later when he, approached by Simon Wiesenthal, says, look, there's nothing I can do. The Supreme Court has ruled he can't be extradited. There's a 15-year statute of limitations. As president, I can't just overrule a judgment of the court. Curiously, and there are many, many extraordinary points of connection, which may be coincidence or not, that's what my book will be about, 35 years after Miguel Schweitzer wrote his legal opinion for the West German government, advising the West German government that they would fail in their application for Rauff's extradition, I was sitting in the House of Lords in the cases against Senator Pinochet, and sitting as my next door neighbor was one of the lawyers for Senator Pinochet, Miguel Schweitzer Jr., the son of the Miguel Schweitzer who had done the legal opinion. So you have these incredible points of connection. And the points of connection go even further. You saw, if you read very carefully, the letter of reference that Walter Rauff wrote for a lady who had been his secretary in Punta Arenas from 1965 to 1968. And you will have seen underneath the name of the company for which Walter Rauff worked, the Pesquera Camelio. The Camelio is a well-known family. Guess who was the lawyer for the Pesquera Camelio in Punta Arenas during that period and subsequently? Miguel Schweitzer Jr. So there are points of connection that I think are worth exploring. And I want to just make one other point that I should have said when I was standing up. In 2017, the non-governmental center Londres 38, which operates as a site of memory, the place on Londres Street, number 38, initiated a proceeding in the courts of Chile to investigate the pesquera, which I had alluded to earlier, for which I believe Walter Rauff worked. The name of that pesquera is the Pesquera Arauco, and it is based, or was based, in San Antonio until it was folded into the Pesquera Chile. Since 2017, 2 ministros, judges, have been investigating from the Court of Appeal the Pesquera Arauco. In that period, I, a British lawyer who can barely understand Spanish and lives 10,000 kilometers away, working on this part-time, has made 1,000 times more progress on the matter of Pesquera Arauco, disappearances from Londres 38, and a potential link with Walter Rauff than these 2 judges have made. That says to me, as a lawyer, there is a problem. It is, I think, nothing short of scandalous that in 5 years there has been no progress in relation to that case, or at least no progress that is discernible or has been made public. On Monday, back in Santiago, I'll have an opportunity to meet with some of the people involved in that investigation in the judge's office. And what I will say to them is, how can it be that I, a distant, far away, foreign law professor, is able to make, with the assistance of Carlos Basso and others who are in this room, more progress than you? That suggests to me there is a lack of political will in really getting to the bottom of these kinds of stories.
Philippe, con esto yo no te quito más tiempo. Tú me dijiste hace unos 2 meses que te pregunté qué opinión tenías hace unos 2 meses acerca de Walter Rauff, en términos humanos. Y me dijiste una opinión muy negativa. Y hoy día tú me cuentas y contaste aquí que has conocido gente que tenía una muy buena opinión de él. ¿Cómo concilias estas dos situaciones? ¿Qué opinión tienes hoy día de este sujeto?
Well, I think that's a theme that runs through all of my writing. If you read Calle Este-Oeste, if you read Ruta de Escapa, you will understand. I'm writing about people like Hans Frank, who was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer. I'm writing about Otto Wächter, who was the deputy to Hans Frank. I've met their sons. I know their sons now very well. I've become very close to Nicholas Frank, who is the son of Hans Frank. And it is plain to me that it is wrong to describe such people as monsters. They did monstrous things. But what is so striking, and for those of you who've read Ruta de Escape, you will see this in particular from the correspondence and the diaries, is that people who did terrible things were also capable of generosity, of humanity, of decency, of humor, and of love. And I think if I had sat down for dinner with Hans Frank, who was a cultured, intelligent, funny, interesting man, I think I would probably have had a very interesting conversation with him and probably would have had a very good dinner. I don't know whether that's the case for Walter Rauff. I don't think he was a cultured man. I don't think he was a particularly interesting man. But I can completely see why a group of 16-year-old young women who are working at the Pesquera Pirata, or who are the secretary at the Pesquera Camelio, would see a man who treated them very correctly, who never lost his temper, who ran a very efficient operation, who allowed them to take their holidays, who didn't cause them any difficulties at all, and they would then say to me, 50 years later, he was a decent guy. He treated us fairly. He seemed very nice. He was a loner. He was elegant. He was discreet. He was a bit cold, but he caused us no problems at all. And I don't think there's a disconnect. I think we all know people who have done terrible things, perhaps not as terrible as Walter Rauff, I hope. But we know also that they are capable of being funny and lovely and interesting and warm and decent and generous. And that's the complexity of human life. The crucial question, how is it that people who can seem to be so decent, normal or lovely can do such terrible things? And that is a universal question. It's not just a question in Germany or in Chile or in the United Kingdom. In my experience, it's a question in the Congo, in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia, around the entire world. Decent, educated, intelligent, cultured human beings are capable of doing the most terrible things. How is this possible? That's the question that fascinates me.